adequacy or the policy itself. The board themselves will take that up at another date. The scheduling is one last thing too. The scheduling is when are the state board are going to take this up. Depends on the extent and nature of the questions and comments we received on policy. They will do that, and they have had several requests for additional meetings and public hearings that currently is under consideration. And I have one other, perhaps, to respond to your area issue. Eric has indicated. This is Eric Oppenheimer has a comment. Perhaps you can respond to that.
Eric Oppenheimer with Division of Water Rights. I just wanted to clarify the area question. The language, the area as defined in this AB 2121 has not changed. It's the mouth of the Mattole River southward to San Francisco Bay. I think the confusion is that the mouth of the Eel River is actually north of the mouth of the Mattole River. Even though on a map it kind of looks like the Eel is south, it's where it drains to.
My reason for asking is if this is all about fisheries, this policy and guidelines is all about fisheries, then why isn't it important as much in the Eel as it is other rivers? I mean, it's like I'm just suspect a little bit of this whole. Is the state reserving the Eel to do something else with, or something? Is that why they exempted it? I mean, normally if you look at the fisheries and you talk to the Fish and Game, they really are concerned about the fisheries issues in the Eel. So for the state to come out with this policy says, oh, we're going to only go to the Mattole and not just a few miles north to the mouth of the Eel. I just wonder why their reasoning is of not including the Eel.
Our reasoning essentially was to stick to what the AB 2121 policy told us to do. We limited the scope. In AB 2121 actually says you could develop such a policy statewide, but you should start in this area, and they specified, again, mouth of the Mattole south to San Francisco. From a resource standpoint, we went with that area as defined in the statute, basically because we were under very limited time and budget constraints. But also, as Steve mentioned, from a water rights perspective, the majority of the pending applications are actually covered in the area that was identified in the AB 2121 language and in the water code language. They're really, if you look at statewide, and Steve talked about this a bit, but if you look at the pending water right applications, there's approximately 500 statewide, and 300 are within this targeted area. About 160 of those are then within the Russian River. So the policy is intended to pertain primarily to water rights administration. So it does make some sense. We're not saying the eel is not important, it is, but there's not as much activity from a water rights standpoint, from a diversion standpoint, in the eel as there is in the current policy area. But mostly it did go back to what the law said.
So if in eel, if a person wanted to change a point for diversion, it wouldn't, AB 2121 wouldn't be affected completely.
Correct.
Thank you.
Supervisor Delmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple of questions to start. If you could maybe state again, and I'm not sure I heard you correctly the first time, in regard to these guidelines, this policy addressing applications that are pending. Did I hear you say it's not intended to deal with those applications, the backlog of the applications?
That's correct. It's not a process or procedural issue, although it may help in processing water rights by defining the in-stream flow requirements for a particular project. But it was not designed to address the backlog of the division. The backlog, we have a number of processes and procedures to address backlog that have been they've been brought up in a number of circumstances here in recent history. And to give you a background, the backlog has gone down significantly, by the way. It was 703 or 4 3 years ago, and it's now, as Eric indicated, it's 500. So there are other measures to do that.
If the backlog wasn't an issue, then why is two of the findings in the bill itself dealing with the backlog of applications? Pending before the board are more than 276 applications to appropriate water and streams in counties of Marin, Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino, and Humboldt. Many of these applications have been pending for a decade. Most of these applications have been pending for at least 5 years. These delays are inappropriate, and they produce regulatory uncertainty for the water user community and the conservation and fishing communities. If 2121 was not designed at all to address the backlog, why out of 6 points, 2 of them relate directly to the backlog?
I'll address that a bit. One of the things that when we're talking about the numbers that you talked about, they are the backlog, and the primary issue that we had in addressing water rights, and especially in these 5 counties, the question is how much water must remain in stream for the protection of fish and wildlife, if you will. And absent any formal in-stream flow studies or formal determinations or recommendations from the Department of Fish and Game or NOAA Fisheries, we didn't have a mechanism to do that. This goes back in the early 90s when we were looking at attempting to resolve or finalize water rights, and we had to address public trust, the CEQA evaluations as well, and we did not have any determination of what the minimum flow requirement would be to protect in-stream flows. So absent prescribing very expensive and time-consuming in-stream flow studies that not necessarily conclusive either, and not necessarily in general agreement amongst the scientific communities on the protocols for that, the 2002 guidelines were the first step. They basically said if you agree to very conservative restrictions, one of which is those Fish and Game NOAA fishery guidelines suggested that a restriction to the minimum flow to the season of diversion in December 15 to March 31. It had a February medium bypass requirement, which is it's the median flow for February, which is the wettest month of record on 60 years of record that we have. So and without getting into further details on that, the idea was here's these conservative numbers, and if you adhere to that, we think we can get past the in-stream flow requirements. Not necessarily all of the requirements to get a permit out, because there are some other procedural things, other folks objecting to them, vested rights determinations, other issues. But in relation to that, if you agree to that, we think we could get past that point. NOAA Fisheries and Fish and Game were in agreement with that. It was their guidelines that were developed in cooperation with us. The policy now goes one step further. It says, okay, now the state board will formally adopt this as a policy. It has the force of regulation, but here is the procedures and process. Both of those have essentially a caveat that said if you are not willing to accept those types of terms and conditions, you can still go forward with individual studies, site-specific studies, to address these types of concerns and perhaps get variations or some other requirement that's not consistent necessarily with those specifically prescribed in the policy or in the 2002 guidelines. Pretty involved answer, but as you can tell, I've been doing this a while.
What is the primary goal?
The primary goal is to set those in-stream flow standards without doing a whole lot of major studies, and we felt like the state board, through its consultants and consultations, we have done that homework.
Well, let me rephrase. What was the primary goal of this policy in regard to protection? Is it protection of the salmonids? Is it a balanced approach? What was the primary goal of this policy?
It kind of includes everything. It's somewhat the canary in the mine with the salmonids, although they do have greater importance because of their listings, both in the Federal Endangered Species Act and in California. So they did have greater emphasis in our process, but it's somewhat of the canary in the mine. We sort of felt like if those species were in good health, that the health of the stream and the system would also be in good health.
So if I heard you correctly, there's a balance there. So you're balancing the needs of